The massive doors of the Volkov council chamber did not open with a bang, they opened with gravity. It was a slow, agonizing push that seemed to displace the very air in the room, carrying the crushing weight of 3 years of history, absolute power, and a betrayal that was finally coming to a head. The moment the hinges groaned, the low murmur of the gathered kapos vanished, silenced by an authority no one had to command. Cassia Moretti stepped into the light. She didn't rush to meet her fate. She didn't falter. She moved as if time itself had paused to acknowledge her, as if the cold marble floor had been laid specifically for this walk. The rhythmic strike of her heels was sharp and precise, a steady, unrelenting pulse that refused to acknowledge the predators watching from the shadows. She was draped in black, not the mourning black of a discarded wife, but a commanding, obsidian black that demanded total submission. Her heavy coat wrapped around her like a suit of armor, elegant and impenetrable, masking everything but her intent. Beneath the thick wool, she was a mystery, yet her presence felt sharper and more dangerous than any blade in the room. Her face was a masterpiece of stoicism. There was no trace of the broken woman Roman expected, no flicker of the grief Alistair had banked on. Only an icy, untouchable calm. Stay with me until the final signature. And comment on your city below. I want to see how far the Moretti bloodline stretches today. Now, let's go. The divorce papers had been finalized on a freezing Tuesday. Cassia had stared at the obsidian folder on her vanity, like it was a ticking bomb. The documents inside were the culmination of Roman Volkov's controlled lethality, a cold, political severing designed to consolidate his empire while discarding her like a spent asset. She hadn't signed them for a full hour. Around her, the Volkov estate was a hive of frantic motion. Guards checked perimeters, advisors whispered in the hallways, and Roman sat at the head of the obsidian table, his silver fox elegance masking the dawning panic he refused to name. He thought he was winning a war of succession. He thought he was finally free of the woman who knew his darkest secrets. Cassia looked at the heavy gold seal of the Volkov crest. For years, she had been the earned calm, in his storm, the invisible anchor that kept his soul from drifting into the abyss. Roman didn't even know the name of the doctor she'd visited in secret. He thought he was signing a divorce. He didn't realize he was signing away the only future his empire had left. As she stood before the heavy doors of the chamber, Cassia felt the weight of the twins beneath her armor, a nightmare revelation that was about to turn Roman's victory into ash. The furniture was no longer staying in the room. It was taking the throne. The air inside the Volkov council chamber didn't just feel cold. It felt sterile, as if the decades of bloodshed and whispered executions had finally scrubbed the room of its humanity. This was the sanctum of the controlled lethality, a space of obsidian tables and high-backed leather chairs where the fate of the city was decided in low, resonant vibrations. At the center of it all sat Roman Volkov, his silver fox hair catching the dim light of the recessed LEDs, his face a mask of absolute, immovable power. For over a century, the alliance between the Moretti and Volkov families had been the iron spine of the underworld. It was a blood pact sealed not just with ink, but with the shared history of 2 empires that had climbed over the bodies of their enemies to reach this height. Cassia Moretti's marriage to Roman had been the ultimate anchor of that pact, a union designed to turn 2 warring lineages into a single, unstoppable force. But as the heavy oak doors of the chamber stood closed, the atmosphere suggested that the anchor was being cut. The kapos and advisors sat in a synchronized, heavy silence. Men like Victor Draken, whose expressions were a toxic mix of calculation and hidden greed, watched the head of the table. To them, this was a political recalibration. They had seen wars, betrayals, and the clinical dismantling of rival syndicates, but the severing of a blood pact was a different kind of violence. It was a tragedy wrapped in a power struggle, and the weight of it seemed to displace the very oxygen in the room. Roman adjusted the obsidian folder in front of him, his movements fluid and predatory. To the world, he was the architect of the city's peace, a man of tailored vests and calculated silence. But beneath the crisp white cotton of his shirt, the jagged lines of his history remained hidden, a permanent reminder that he had earned his throne through 1,000 violences. He looked at the empty chair across from him, the space Cassia had occupied as his earned calm for 3 years. He had convinced himself that this divorce was a strategic necessity, a way to consolidate his rule without the emotional liability of a woman who knew where his scars were hidden. He didn't realize that by severing the pact, he was removing the only thing that kept his soul grounded. The chimes of the external security gate echoed through the chamber, a rhythmic, heavy thud that made the water in the glasses on the table ripple. The Moretti bloodline was at the door. Roman felt a sudden, visceral jolt in his chest, a crazy spark of intuition he refused to acknowledge. He had spent his life surrounding himself with men who were paid to be brave, yet as the doors began to groan on their hinges, he felt a flicker of the nightmare he was about to create. The history of the Moretti-Volkov alliance was written in the marble of the floor and the obsidian of the table. It was a legacy of power so absolute it never had to raise its voice. But as the doors opened, the silence of the chamber didn't just break, it shattered. The room was no longer a sanctuary of business. It was a theater of war, and the woman walking through those doors wasn't coming to sign a contract. She was coming to claim the future he didn't even know he had. The severing of power had officially begun, and in the cold, calculated light of the council, the dragon of the city was about to realize that some blood pacts were never meant to be undone. Roman did not look away. He sat at the head of the obsidian table, his fingers steepled, his silver fox elegance acting as a shield for the visceral jolt that had spiked through his chest the moment Cassia stepped into the light. He had expected tears, or perhaps the sharp, jagged edge of a woman scorned, something he could manage with the clinical, controlled lethality that had made him a king. Instead, he was met with a stoicism so absolute it felt like a physical barrier. He reached for the obsidian folder resting before him, the gold-embossed seal of the Volkov crest mocking the heavy silence of the room. With a slow, deliberate motion, he slid the documents across the cold marble surface toward the empty chair where Cassia refused to sit. "The terms are as we discussed, Cassia," Roman said, his voice a low, resonant vibration that carried the weight of a final judgment. "The Moretti estates remain yours. The liquid assets have been transferred to a private secure line. All that remains is the formal severing of the blood pact." Cassia did not look at the papers. She didn't even glance at the gold fountain pen resting atop the folder. She stood perfectly still, her head held high, the heavy black wool of her armor coat absorbing the harsh LED light of the chamber. Her face gave nothing away, no anger, no grief, no trace of the nightmare she was currently carrying beneath the fabric. Around the table, the atmosphere shifted. The Kapos, men who had built empires on the foundations of violence and silence, began to shift in their seats. They were used to seeing people break in this room. They were used to the frantic bargaining of the desperate or the hollow-eyed stare of the defeated. But Cassia's earned calm was something different. It was an unreachable, icy stillness that made the battle-hardened men flinch. It wasn't the silence of a victim. It was the silence of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Victor Draken, sitting 3 seats down, narrowed his eyes, his expression a toxic mix of shock and calculation. He looked at Cassia, then back at Roman, his mind already recalculating the line of succession. He had banked on a messy divorce, a moment of weakness he could exploit to destabilize Roman's rule. But looking at Cassia, he realized he wasn't witnessing a domestic collapse. He was witnessing a change in the very gravity of the room. "Sign the papers, Cassia," Roman rasped, his own voice sounding thinner to his ears than he intended. The power anchor of his personality was visibly cracking. He looked at her unreadable face, searching for a flicker of the woman who had been his anchor for 3 years, but he found only a stranger. "Let us finish this with the dignity the alliance deserves." Cassia finally moved, but it wasn't toward the pen. She stepped closer to the table, her shadow stretching across the obsidian surface until it swallowed the documents whole. She looked directly into Roman's hazel eyes, her own gaze holding a fierce, quiet confidence that made the air in the room feel heavy and electric. "Dignity is a luxury for those who still have something to lose, Roman," she whispered, her voice a cool, silver thread that refused to tremble. You think you are signing a divorce. You think you are consolidated your power by discarding the only person who truly knows your name. She reached out, her hand hovering over the gold seal, but she didn't touch it. Instead, she looked at the men around the table, her icy calm, commanding their total, fearful attention. She saw their calculation, their greed, and their shock. She saw the empire Roman had built, a world of steel and ego that was about to realize its foundations were made of sand. I will sign, she said, her voice dropping to a register that carried the weight of a blood oath. But I want every man in this room to remember the face I am wearing today. Because when the nightmare begins, and you find yourselves reaching for the anchor you threw away, you will remember that I didn't leave because I was broken. I left because I was already finished with you. Roman felt a crazy surge of panic, a visceral realization that he was losing more than a wife. He was losing the future. He looked at the unreadable face of Cassia Moretti and finally understood that the controlled lethality he had mastered was useless against a woman who had already moved beyond his reach. The silence in the council chamber wasn't just a lack of noise. It was the sound of 1,000 social hierarchies beginning to shatter, and as Cassia finally reached for the pen, Roman Volkov realized his victory had never felt more like a defeat. Victor Draken sat in the third high-backed leather chair from the end of the table, his presence as sharp and cold as the obsidian surface he rested his hands upon. While the rest of the kapos were reeling from the sheer force of Cassia's unreadable gaze, Victor was doing what he did best. He was measuring the air. He was a man who lived in the margins of other people's mistakes, an architect of social and corporate hierarchy who understood that a king was only as strong as the shadow he cast. And right now, Roman Volkov's shadow was flickering. Victor watched the way Roman's fingers twitched, a micro-expression of panic that would have been invisible to anyone else. But to Victor, it was a siren. For years, the Volkov Empire had been an impenetrable fortress of controlled lethality, held together by the ironclad marriage between Roman and the Moretti bloodline. Victor had waited in the background shadows, a loyal advisor with a predator's patience, waiting for the first sign of rot in the foundations. He had anticipated that this divorce would be the sledgehammer, but he hadn't expected Cassia to be the one wielding it. As Cassia stood there, draped in her black armor coat, Victor felt a shift in the room's gravity. The silence wasn't just a lack of sound, it was a vacuum of power, and he could feel the hunger of the other men around the table rising to fill it. They were recalculating, their loyalty to Roman fraying with every second he remained speechless in the face of his wife's icy calm. Victor's eyes moved from Cassia's stoic face to the gold-embossed folder, and he began to weave a new tapestry of opportunity. To Victor, people were not individuals. They were variables in a long-term equation of dominance. If the Moretti alliance was truly dead, Roman was no longer the immovable object he claimed to be. Without Cassia as his earned calm, Roman was just a man with too many enemies and a silver fox legacy that was beginning to look like old age. Victor leaned back slightly, the movement silent and predatory, as he watched Roman struggle to maintain his power anchor. He saw the way the kapos looked at Cassia, not with the dismissal they usually reserved for office furniture, but with a dawning, terrifying respect. If she walked out that door with her head held high, she wasn't just leaving a marriage, she was taking a portion of the Volkov aura with her. Victor realized that the real strike shouldn't be against Roman directly, but through the chaos that Cassia was about to leave in her wake. His mind raced through the offshore accounts, the north side shipping lanes, and the fragile zoning bets that Alistair Black had mismanaged. All of it was connected, a house of cards that required a single, sharp push to collapse. As Roman rasped his command for Cassia to sign, Victor felt a surge of smug satisfaction. He was witnessing a change in the line of succession, a nightmare for Roman that would be the dawn of a new order for Draken. He adjusted the heavy silver ring on his finger, his gaze settling on the back of Roman's neck, where the silver fox hair met the tailored collar of his tuxedo. The dragon of the city was bleeding, and Victor Draken was already tasting the iron in the air. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to move. He simply had to wait for the final signature to hit the page. The severing of the marriage was the invitation he had spent a lifetime waiting for, and as the tension in the council chamber reached its breaking point, Victor prepared to claim the ruins of the empire that Roman was too proud to realize he had already lost. Roman reached for the heavy gold fountain pen, his movements measured and clinical. He intended for this to be the final stroke, the surgical incision that would bleed the Moretti influence out of his life once and for all. But as he uncapped the pen, the air in the chamber seemed to thicken, turning heavy and humid. His gaze, usually a weapon of controlled lethality, drifted from the ink-stained nib to the woman standing across from him. Cassia hadn't moved, yet something about her silhouette had shifted. It was a minute change, a subtle adjustment of her weight, a shallow intake of breath that caused the heavy wool of her black armor coat to pull slightly across her midsection. To any of the capos at the table, it was nothing. To Victor Draken, it was merely a pause in the drama. But Roman had spent 3 years learning the architecture of Cassia's body, the way she breathed when she was tired, the way her posture held the line against his own dark moods. He knew the rhythm of her life better than his own. And suddenly, the rhythm was off. He watched her hand, the one not resting on the obsidian table. It was tucked slightly into the fold of her coat, a protective, almost reflexive gesture that he had never seen her make in public. Her fingers were splayed, pressing softly into the fabric over her womb. It was a movement so instinctive, so raw, that it bypassed her icy calm and struck Roman with the force of a physical blow. The power anchor at the head of the table didn't just crack, it groaned. Roman's dawning intuition flared into a visceral, nightmare realization. He felt a cold sweat break across his neck, his hazel eyes narrowing as he performed a silent, frantic audit of the last few months. The late nights she spent in the solarium. The scent of ginger tea that had begun to replace her morning espresso. The way she had gently pulled away from his touch in the weeks before the divorce papers were drafted. He had attributed it to the rot of their marriage. He had thought she was pulling away because she hated him. He looked at her face again. Her expression was still stoic, still unreadable, but now he saw the earned calm for what it truly was, a shield. She wasn't just standing there as his former wife. She was standing there as the vessel of his legacy. The weight she carried into the room wasn't the burden of history, it was the weight of the future. The gold pen remained suspended in the air, a drop of dark ink trembling on the tip before falling and blooming like a bloodstain on the white parchment of the divorce decree. Roman's hand began to shake, a micro-tremor that sent a shockwave of paranoia through the men watching him. He didn't look at the paper. He didn't look at Victor. He looked only at the slight curve of Cassia's coat, the place where her hand remained anchored. "Cassia," he rasped, the words sounding like a broken oath. The sound of his voice, stripped of its usual resonance, made the capos shift in their seats. Victor Draken's eyes sharpened, his calculation taking a dark, jagged turn. He saw the dragon falter. He saw the predator lose his scent. Cassia's eyes flickered, just for a second. The Cinderella reveal was no longer about the dress or the status. It was about the bloodline. She saw that he knew. She saw the visceral regret beginning to swallow his silver fox arrogance whole. She didn't flinch. She didn't offer him the comfort of a lie. She simply stood her ground, her head held high, as the controlled lethality of the council chamber was replaced by a dawning, suffocating panic. Roman felt the floorboards of his empire rotting beneath him. He had spent his life building walls to keep people out, only to realize he had locked himself in a tomb while his life's blood was walking toward the exit. The crack in the armor was no longer a metaphor, it was a total collapse. As the silence in the room became a deafening roar of realization, Roman Volkov finally understood that the severing he had ordered was about to cost him everything he never realized he wanted. The gold pen slipped from Roman's fingers, clattering against the obsidian table with a sound that felt like a gavel striking a coffin. The silence that followed was no longer the heavy, respectful quiet of a council. It was a vacuum, cold and suffocating. Roman's hazel eyes were fixed on Cassia's midsection, his gaze burning through the heavy black wool of her coat as if he could see the biological clock he had tried to stop. Cassia, he repeated, his voice barely a ghost of the power anchor baritone that usually commanded the room. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a shrill, violent shriek that made the capos flinch. Tell me I am wrong. Tell me the weight you are carrying is just the ghost of the Moretti pride. Cassia did not move. She remained standing in the harsh LED light, her head tilted slightly, her expression an unbreakable mask of earned calm. She didn't offer him a confession, and she didn't offer him a lie. Her untouchable silence was the ultimate weapon, a shield that rendered Roman's controlled lethality useless. She watched him descend into a dawning, visceral panic, her own heartbeat steady and rhythmic beneath the armor of her coat. Roman moved around the table, his silver fox elegance replaced by the frantic energy of a man watching his empire evaporate. He stopped inches from her, his breath shallow, his hands hovering in the air as if afraid that touching her would confirm the nightmare he had authored. "You are going to let me sign it," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and dawning horror. "You are going to walk out of these doors and take my blood into the dark without a word. You are going to let the Volkov name end with a signature on a piece of paper." The men around the table were no longer just observers. They were witnesses to a total collapse of hierarchy. Victor Draken leaned forward, his face a mask of shock and calculation, his eyes darting between the boss's panic and the wife's stillness. The divorce was forgotten. The political recalibration was over. They were now witnessing a change in the line of succession that none of them had prepared for. Cassia finally met Roman's gaze, her eyes holding a fierce, quiet confidence that made him look small. "I wasn't taking your blood into the dark, Roman," she whispered, her voice a cool silver wire that cut through his panic. "I was taking mine. You made it very clear that this alliance was a liability. You decided that history was a weight you no longer wanted to carry. I am simply fulfilling your request." Roman's face drained of color, turning a sickly, translucent white. The realization that his own cold, strategic logic was being used to justify his erasure was the ultimate nightmare. He reached out, his fingers brushing the fabric of her coat, and for a second, the predator was gone, replaced by a man who realized he had built a throne out of ash. "I won't sign it," he rasped, his hand gripping the edge of her sleeve. "The papers, the divorce, it's a mistake. We'll rewrite the pact. We'll consolidate under the new heirs." "Cassia, look at me." Cassia did not look away, but she did not soften. She stepped back, breaking the contact with a slow, deliberate grace that was more painful than a strike. She was the focal point of the room, the woman who held the future of the city in her hands, and she had never looked more like a queen. "The nightmare isn't that you're losing a wife, Roman," she told him, her voice carrying to the furthest corners of the silent chamber. "The nightmare is that you finally realized you can't control the only thing that actually matters. You wanted a conquered world. You got it, but you won't get them." The controlled lethality of the room had officially evaporated, replaced by the suffocating weight of a truth that could not be undone. Roman Volkov stood in the center of his kingdom, surrounded by men who feared him and a rival who wanted to replace him, and realized that for the first time in his life, he was completely and utterly powerless. The discovery was complete, and as the silence stretched, the dragon of the city finally understood the true cost of his divorce. The air in the council chamber, already thin with Roman's dawning panic, suddenly curdled into something far more volatile. It wasn't just the presence of an air that hung between them now. It was the dawning, clinical realization that Cassia was carrying too. The mention of twins didn't just complicate the divorce. It effectively rewrote the laws of the Volkov Empire in a single, breathless heartbeat. Roman's hand, still clutching the fabric of Cassia's sleeve, went numb. Twins. 2 lines of succession. 2 targets. 2 crowns. The controlled lethality that had governed the room for decades vanished, replaced by a visceral, war of blood, energy that sparked in the eyes of every man seated at the obsidian table. A single heir was a legacy. 2 was a power struggle waiting to be born. Victor Draken was the first to react, though his movement was subtle, a leaning forward into the light that signaled his predatory intent. His mind, always a machine of shock and calculation, was already dividing the room. He looked at the other capos, gauging who would remain loyal to Roman's failing power anchor, and who would see the twins as an opportunity to carve out their own piece of the future. The silence of the room was replaced by a low, dangerous murmur, like the growl of a pack realizing the alpha was wounded and the spoils had just doubled. 2, Victor whispered, the word carrying a sharp, jagged edge. A spare for the throne, or a rival for the bloodline. Roman, you haven't just signed a divorce. You've signed a civil war. Roman spun toward the table, his silver fox elegance finally fracturing into raw, unadulterated fury. Silence, he roared, but the authority in his voice lacked its usual weight. He looked at the faces of his men, the men who had built his empire with blood and silence, and saw for the first time the flickers of betrayal. They weren't looking at him as their leader anymore. They were looking at him as a man who had almost discarded the most valuable assets the Volkov family had ever produced. Cassia remained at the center of the storm, her icy calm, acting as a lighthouse in the rising chaos. She felt the heavy gaze of the capos as they took sides, their loyalty shifting like sand in a gale. She saw the way Victor's hand moved toward his inner pocket, and the way the Moretti loyalist guards at the door tightened their grip on their weapons. The council chamber had become a den of wolves, and the nightmare Roman had authored was only just beginning. The blood pact cannot be undone with 2 heirs on the line, one of the elder capos stated, his voice a dry rasp that carried the weight of tradition. Moretti blood and Volkov blood are now inextricably linked. Roman, if you let her walk out that door with both of them, you are handing half of this city to her family before they even take their first breath. Roman turned back to Cassia, his face a mask of visceral regret and dawning desperation. He realized that Victor was already calculating the cost of an assassination or a kidnapping. The twins weren't just children to these men. They were the ultimate currency of the underworld. Cassia, stay, Roman pleaded, his voice dropping to a register that was almost a prayer. I will burn the divorce papers. I will purge the council of anyone who dares to look at you with anything but total submission. Just stay. Cassia looked at the obsidian table, then at the men who were already preparing for the blood war that would follow her departure. She felt the twins move, a small, rhythmic flutter that grounded her in the earned calm she had spent years building. She didn't look at the power she could have. She looked at the chains she was finally breaking. You're afraid, Roman, she whispered, her voice a cool silver wire that silenced the room's murmur. But you're not afraid for me. You're afraid of what happens to your empire when you realize I'm the one taking the future with me. You wanted a conquered world, but you forgot that a world without a legacy is just a graveyard. She turned toward the door, her armor-like coat swirling around her as she walked away from the obsidian table and the men who had spent their lives waiting for this moment. Behind her, the council chamber descended into a violent cacophony of raised voices and shifting alliances. The twins factor had officially turned the divorce into a revolution, and as Cassia stepped into the cold night air, she knew the war of blood had only just begun. Roman Volkov stood alone in the center of the storm, realizing that he had built a throne of ash, while his true power was walking out the door. Roman did not reach for the pen. He could not. His hand remained frozen in midair, a few inches from the heavy obsidian table, as if touching the wood would finalize the nightmare he had spent months meticulously planning. The dawning panic in his hazel eyes was no longer a micro-expression. It was a frantic, visible collapse. He looked at the twins, or rather, the space where they existed beneath Cassia's black armor coat, and then back at her face, searching for a single crack in her icy calm that he could exploit. Cassia, wait, he rasped, his voice a low, desperate vibration that barely carried over the rising murmur of the capos. The council, they don't understand. I didn't know. The papers, they are formality of a man who was blind. I will burn them. I will rewrite the Moretti-Volkov pact tonight. You won't just be my wife. You will be the regent. The throne, Cassia. It's yours. The room held its breath. Victor Draken's eyes narrowed into sharp, clinical slivers of calculation. He watched the power anchor of the city offer up his entire empire just to stop a woman from walking out a door. It was the ultimate surrender, a total reversal of the controlled lethality that had defined Roman's rule. To the men around the table, Roman was no longer a king. He was a beggar. Cassia didn't look at the throne Roman was metaphorically dragging to her feet. She didn't look at Victor, or the Kapos who were already taking sides in the war of blood that was brewing in the shadows. She looked only at the gold fountain pen resting on the white parchment of the divorce decree. "The throne is a cage, Roman," she whispered, her voice a cool silver wire that silenced the room. "You've spent your life decorating it with the bones of your enemies and the silence of your allies. You think offering me a seat at your table is a gift? It's an invitation to join you in the dark." She reached out then, her hand steady and precise. Unlike Roman, she did not hesitate. Her fingers closed around the cold metal of the pen, the gold nib catching the harsh LED light of the chamber. "No," Roman breathed, a visceral surge of regret making him lunge forward. He grabbed the edge of the obsidian folder, his knuckles white, his silver fox elegance completely shattered. "Cassia, don't. If you sign that, the protection of the Volkov name is gone. Victor, the others, they will see you as a target. You can't protect them alone." Cassia finally looked at him, and for a second, the icy calm softened into a look of profound, clinical pity. It was the look of a woman who had already seen the end of his empire. "I have been protecting you for 3 years, Roman," she told him, her voice dropping to a register that only he could hear. "I was the one who caught the north side discrepancies. I was the one who anticipated Victor's move on the shipyard. You think I need your name to survive? Your name is the only thing that makes me a target." She lowered the pen to the paper. The scratching of the nib against the heavy cardstock was the only sound in the vacuum of the council chamber. It was a rhythmic, final sound, the sound of 1,000 social hierarchies finally shattering. She signed her name with a flourish of earned calm, a signature that was a declaration of war and a decree of independence all at once. The moment the ink dried, the severing of power was complete. Cassia capped the pen with a soft, clinical click and slid the folder back toward Roman. He stared at her signature as if it were a death warrant. The nightmare discovery had reached its inevitable conclusion. He had his conquered world. He had his obsidian table and his silent Kapos. But the legacy, the bloodline, and the woman who had been his earned calm were now officially beyond his reach. "The car is waiting downstairs, Mr. Volkov," Cassia said, using his formal name like a weapon. "I believe you have a council to manage. They look hungry." She turned, her heavy black coat swirling around her like a shroud as she walked toward the heavy oak doors. She didn't look back at the dawning panic on Roman's face or the shock and calculation in Victor's eyes. She had chosen freedom over the throne, and as she stepped out of the chamber and into the cold night air, the office furniture didn't just walk out. It took the future with it. Roman Volkov stood alone at the head of his empty table, finally understanding that the only thing more dangerous than an enemy was a woman who no longer had anything to lose. 3 years had passed since the obsidian doors of the council chamber had clicked shut behind Cassia Moretti, yet for Roman Volkov, the echoes of her heels against the marble floor had never truly faded. He still sat at the head of the same long table, the power anchor of a city that had grown larger, wealthier, and far more dangerous under his singular, iron-fisted rule. To the world, he was the apex predator, a man who had successfully navigated the severing of power and emerged with a conquered world. But inside the hollowed-out silence of his penthouse, Roman was a man ruling a graveyard of his own making. The controlled lethality that had once been his greatest weapon had curdled into a cold, obsessive paranoia. He no longer spent his evenings weighing the shipping lanes or the zoning bets that Victor Draken still hungered for. Instead, he spent them in the flickering glow of surveillance monitors and private investigator reports. The empire was thriving, but its architect was a fractured spirit, haunted by the nightmare discovery of that rainy Tuesday. He had become a ghost in his own palace, a silver fox king who had traded his soul for a throne of ash. Every report that crossed his desk was an exercise in visceral regret. His agents had scoured the Moretti estates, the Mediterranean coast, and the high-altitude retreats of the Alps, but Cassia had vanished with a clinical precision that Roman himself had taught her. She was a ghost, a shadow that carried his bloodline far beyond the reach of his scanners. Roman would sit for hours staring at the last photo he had of her, a grainy shot from a security camera in a Zurich train station, where the heavy black wool of her coat still looked like armor, protecting the twins factor. That was now his only obsession. Victor Draken still sat at the council table, his eyes always sharp with shock and calculation, waiting for the moment Roman's distraction became a fatal opening. Victor saw the rot. He saw the way the boss lingered on folders that had nothing to do with the Volkov interests. The city felt the tension too. The underworld was a den of wolves who could smell the iron of a wounded alpha. Roman's authority was no longer a resonant rumble. It was a thin, brittle wire stretched to the breaking point. They would be nearly 3 now, Roman. The voice belonged to Malachi, his most trusted advisor, who stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that glittered like fallen diamonds. Roman didn't look up from the leather-bound ledger on his desk. He didn't have to. The number was etched into his marrow. 1,095 days. 2,190 hours of wondering if they had his hazel eyes or the Moretti stoicism. "I didn't lose a wife that day, Malachi," Roman rasped, his voice sounding like dry parchment. "I lost the only part of me that was real. The rest of this, the towers, the ships, the blood packs, it's just noise." He stood up, his joints aching with a weight that no tailored tuxedo could hide. He walked to the window, looking down at the streets where he had once hunted his enemies with predatory pride. Now, every black car that passed was a potential vessel for his children. Every woman in a heavy coat was a phantom of the wife he had discarded. He had built an empire that feared him, controlled everything that could be controlled, but the one thing that carried his future was no longer his to claim. The shadow of the empire was no longer a projection of his power, it was a shroud. Roman Volkov understood now that the earned calm Cassia had displayed wasn't just a shield, it was her final judgment. She had left him with exactly what he had asked for, a conquered world. And as he stood in the freezing silence of his heights, he realized that a world without a legacy was the most magnificent prison ever built. The dragon was still on his throne, but he was finally beginning to understand that the severing was a wound that would never stop bleeding. The park in a quiet corner of the city was a place Roman Volkov would never have set foot in 3 years ago. It was too open, too vulnerable, filled with the unregulated sounds of laughter and the soft rustle of leaves that didn't obey a corporate hierarchy. But today, the dragon of the city sat in the back of a nondescript sedan, his silver fox profile partially hidden by the tinted glass, watching the world through a lens of absolute, agonizing distance. He had successfully navigated every war, crushed every rival like Victor Draken, and solidified a rule so absolute that the very name Volkov was synonymous with the city itself. He owned the skyline, the shipping lanes, and the silence of every man in the council chamber. And yet, as he watched the woman across the grass, he realized he was the poorest man in existence. Cassia Moretti didn't wear the heavy black armor coat today. She wore a simple, light-colored cardigan that moved with the breeze, her earned calm no longer a shield against predators, but a mantle of genuine peace. She looked younger, the icy calm, having thawed into a warm, vibrant presence that made Roman's chest ache with a visceral, jagged regret. She was no longer a shadow in his office. She was the sun in someone else's world. Then he saw them, 2 small figures, barely 3 years old, erupted from behind a cluster of oaks. They ran with a clumsy, beautiful ferocity, one with the dark, thick hair of the Moretti line, the other with a defiant tilt of the chin that was unmistakably Volkov. They were the twins factor that had turned a divorce into a revolution, the bloodline he had almost signed away for a few more percentages of market share. He watched them all into the grass, heard their high-pitched giggles carry over the distance, and felt a nightmare realization finally settle into his marrow. They didn't know his name. They didn't know the weight of the Silver Fox legacy or the controlled lethality of the empire he had built for them. To them, he was just a shadow in a black car, a stranger in a world they were discovering without his guidance. He had spent his life building a throne so high that he had eventually run out of oxygen, and now, from his magnificent heights, he was witnessing the future walk away from him. "Sir?" Malachi's voice was a low, hesitant vibration from the driver's seat. "We should move. Victor's men are active on the north side. The council meeting begins in an hour." Roman didn't look at his advisor. He didn't look at the phone buzzing with the demands of an empire that never slept. He watched Cassia scoop both children into her arms, their small hands gripping her shoulders, their faces pressed against her neck in a gesture of absolute, untouchable trust. It was the only blood pact that mattered, and it was the only one he had failed to honor. "Let them be, Malachi," Roman rasped, his voice a hollow ghost of the power he once wielded. "The council can wait. The city can wait. It's all just-ish anyway." He leaned back into the shadows of the car, the Cinderella reveal, reaching its final, devastating conclusion. He had conquered the world. He had won the war. But as the sedan pulled away from the curb, leaving the laughter behind, Roman Volkov finally understood the true definition of loss. It wasn't the death of a rival or the collapse of a firm. It was the realization that you own everything that can be bought, but have absolutely no one to leave it to. The dragon was alone in his sky, ruling a conquered world that was as empty as his own heart. He had lost her long before the chamber doors closed. He just hadn't realized that when she walked out, she took the sun with her. The story of Roman Volkov and Cassia Moretti serves as a poignant study in power dynamics, the consequences of emotional neglect, and the true definition of legacy. Beyond its dramatic mafia setting, it offers several key educational insights into human psychology and professional ethics. The narrative highlights the difference between legitimate power, Roman's title and empire, and expert/information power, Cassia's mastery of the firm's secrets and strategy. It teaches that true influence is often held by those who architecture the success from the shadows. When Roman discards Cassia, he realizes too late that his power was a facade supported by her competence. Roman views his marriage and alliance as a transaction, an asset to be liquidated when it no longer serves his immediate political goals. This illustrates the failure of transactional leadership, which ignores the human capital and emotional bonds that provide long-term stability. The story shows that treating people like furniture or assets inevitably leads to a single point of failure. Cassia's earned calm is an example of high-level emotional intelligence, EQ, and stoicism. She uses silence and restraint not as a sign of weakness, but as a strategic shield. This teaches the educational value of strategic restraint. The person who can control their emotions in a high-pressure environment, the den of lions, ultimately controls the outcome of the conflict. The final chapters explore the hollow victory archetype. In organizational and personal life, the pursuit of conquering the world, or achieving a goal at the expense of one's legacy and integrity results in a magnificent prison. It teaches that a goal achieved without a meaningful purpose or someone to share it with, the twins factor, is a form of failure disguised as success. Cassia's transformation from a discarded wife to an untouchable figure is a lesson in self-validation. She refuses to accept the low value Roman places on her. By walking away from a throne to choose her own freedom, she demonstrates that one's worth is not determined by their status in a hierarchy, but by their courage to define their own path. The story functions as a study in strategic empathy. It warns that a leader who loses sight of the people behind the power eventually finds themselves ruling a silent kingdom, proving that the most valuable blood pacts are the ones built on mutual respect rather than mere utility.